Welcome to our tour of Bound Brook Island. Your presenters are Alice Iquesa, Barbara Brenneso, and John Portnoy. We are all board members of the Friends of Herring River, which supports and does public outreach for habitat restoration in the Herring River estuary. Bound Brook Island lies in the northwest corner of Wellfleet. It is bordered on the north by Truro, on the east by Bound Brook and the Herring River, and on the south by the Herring River and its marshes, and on the west by Cape Cod Bay. The island is essentially a mound of sands and gravels left by meltwater streams flowing over retreating glaciers about 15,000 years ago. It was one of the two oldest settled parts of the town, the other being Fresh Brook in Wellfleet's southeast corner. At the time of European settlement, Bound Brook Island was an island, in the sense of being surrounded by salt marshes. Residents traveled to and from the island via footbridges and by narrow, shallow creeks at low tide. 20th century diking and drainage for mosquito control eliminated the marsh grasses and allowed trees to invade the floodplain, so that now the island is hardly distinguishable. The first humans to settle Bound Brook Island were Native Americans who started to live near the Herring River estuary about 5,000 years ago. An estuary is a place where a freshwater river or stream meets salt water, in this case, the Herring River and Wellfleet Bay. This time period, 5,000 years ago, coincided with the development of estuaries. The development of estuaries led to a great increase in shellfish, such as oysters, scallops, and clams, and large seasonal runs of fish like alewives and blueback herring. Subsistence farming was also practiced. In 2011, the National Park acquired the Baker Biddle property, which we will visit later on our walk. In 2012, it did an archaeological study of the land. In a very short time, a great number of artifacts were discovered: tools, pottery, shells, animal bones, and a Native American hearth. This is evidence of extensive use of this area by Native Americans from 5,000 to 1,000 years ago. Before we start our tour, we will look at a walk of our map. The walk will start at the Atwood-Higgins house, and then we will go to the Island Schoolhouse site. From there, we will cross Bound Brook Road and walk north to the overlook of Cape Cod Bay. We will backtrack to the Lombard Cemetery, walk in the woods to the modernist Hatch House. We will then head down to the beach and walk south. At Bound Brook Landing, we will leave the beach and go into the dunes to Bound Brook Island Road and the Baker Biddle property. We will finish the walk by going from Baker Biddle property to the Atwood-Higgins house. Our walk starts at the Atwood-Higgins house. Usually when we start a walk, we say to be certain to have sunscreen and water. We remind everyone we might need bug spray and that everyone should stay on the path to avoid tall grasses, since this is tick territory. Also, when the walk is over, we caution you to do a tick check when you get home. However, this is not necessary today, since you are sitting comfortably at home and our tour is virtual. This is the path from Bound Brook Island Road to the Atwood-Higgins house. Originally, when the Europeans started to settle the Outer Cape, Bound Brook was not meant as a settlement site. Instead, land was parceled out to families who lived further south. Eastham Town records of 1696 show grants from Bound Brook Island of woodlots, pasture, farmland, and meadow. However, by the early 1700s, families started to live on the island. We approach the house from the back. The back of the house faced the road. The front, south side, faced the Herring River. The Atwood-Higgins house was built in 1730 by Thomas Higgins and was owned by a series of Atwoods and Higginses until 1961, when George Higgins donated it to the U.S. Department of Interior to become part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. The site of the house was chosen wisely, satisfying all the criteria for subsistence living at that time, both land-based and maritime. There were salt meadows with hay for cattle, trees to build vessels and houses, and to heat the houses. And though the soil was not as rich as nearby Eastham or Truro, some farming could be done. Also, Bound Brook was an island, and mariners had access to the sea via the shoreline or the Herring River. Let's look at some examples of a Cape Cod house, of which the Cape Atwood Higgins house is a good example. It was originally built as a half cape, but expanded over the years so that by the early 1800s, it was a full cape. A half cape has a front door with 2 windows on one side of the door. A 3/4 cape has the addition of a window on the opposite side of the door. A full cape has 2 windows on each side of the door. Here are some other hallmarks of a Cape Cod style house. A steeply pitched roof to shed rain and snow. The steep roof meant that even though the house had only 1 story, it had an attic under a gable roof where children usually slept. It was low to the ground, which sheltered it from winds. It had a central fireplace that provided heat for all the downstairs rooms. It was shingled on 3 sides, and if the owner could afford it, the 4th side had painted clapboards. The windows were close to the roof line, and it had little or no decoration except perhaps a transom or fan lights above the door. The characteristics of a Cape Cod house are clearly seen in the Atwood Higgins house. It is hard to picture today with the river so reduced that just below the Atwood Higgins house, the 100 tons burden schooner Freemason was built in 1800.
This is a photo of the site as it looked in 1903, when Bound Brook Island was the center of Wellfleet's maritime activity. Here at the mouth of the river, just south of Bound Brook Island, there was a major river herring fishery. River herring begin their acclimation to fresh water in the estuary and then start to make their way to Herring Pond, about a 4-mile journey. Wellfleet's Herring River was a source of income to the town and its residents. River herring run every spring from the ocean to freshwater ponds where they spawn. The river herring are a valuable source of bait, especially for cod and lobsters. The town leased rights to the fisheries to individuals and companies. The proceeds helped to pay for the expenses of running the town and schools. The river was impounded to harvest herring. Gates, which could be open or closed, were set up to trap the herring or allow their passage. Each year, the town hired a gatekeeper to control the gates. The fish were put into barrels at the fish station, and then they were sent to market using the conveniently located railroad. A close-up shows the gates in the foreground, barrels on the fish station dock, and the railroad trestle in the background. Some local harvesters dip netting herring in front of the gates. And this is another way of harvesting herring using a seine net.
By 1873, the Atwood Higgins house was in disrepair and no longer used as a permanent home. Why? Duck Harbor was silting in, and inshore fishing, which we just learned about, was collapsing. Bound Brook Island was losing its population. By the 1870s, homes from Bound Brook Island were being moved to the present center of Wellfleet. Even with this movement of homes, Wellfleet as a whole was losing population. The population went from 2,135 in 1873 to 826 in 1920. That is a total of 47 years. So what are these buildings just north of the Atwood Higgins house? They look old, but in reality, date only to the early 20th century. In 1920, George Higgins, a businessman from Brookline, Massachusetts, inherited his great-grandfather's 1730 house. It had been abandoned since 1873, and it needed a great deal of repair. Here he is shown with local people he hired to help him as he worked on the house. There are people in town today who still remember having a relative who worked on the property. George also had the romantic notion of creating an idea of a colonial homestead. This is a map of the buildings he created. They included a country store and post office. George and his wife enjoyed greeting guests on the porch of the store and post office. In this 1950s photos, you can see it was a popular stop on tours led by the Wellfleet Historical Society. Here is the barn where he one time kept his horse, and later he filled it with antique tools and farm equipment. For guests who did not like the primitive conditions and outhouse of the old house, he built a guest house with running water and electricity. Remember, although these buildings look old, they date to the 20th century. When the Department of Interior acquired the house, it immediately recognized the importance of the 1730s Atwood Higgins house, but largely ignored these other buildings. Today, however, there is renewed interest in them since they represent an example of Wellfleet's transition from the decline of the fishing industry to a new vacation economy. Our next stop is the site of the island schoolhouse. The path to the site follows the former Bound Brook Island Road, which passed between the Atwood Higgins house and George Higgins's colonial homestead. He successfully petitioned the selectmen to move the road to its present location. This is the monument marking the site of the school. The Massachusetts Bay Colony played a key role in establishing a public school system. As early as 1647, the law requiring towns of a certain size to have public schools. Reading was considered important for the success of the colony. There were two main reasons why it was believed everyone needed to be literate. One, in order to read the Bible, which was a force that kept the colony together, and two, to know and understand the laws that govern the colony. The study of arithmetic was important for conducting business, and advanced math was key for boys who wanted to be sea captains and had to know how to operate such devices as astrolabes. At first, boys were educated, but very soon, all children received an education. Probably the most famous student at the school was Lorenzo Dow Baker. He was born on the island in 1840, went to sea at age 10, was master of a ship at age 21. In 1870, he introduced bananas from Jamaica to the east coast of the United States. In 1878, he founded the Boston Fruit Company, which eventually became the United Fruit Company. As we have said before, by the 1870s, the population of Wellfleet was declining. Schools started to be consolidated, and in the 1880s, the island school was sold. In 1924, a memorial stone with a plaque was erected to commemorate the school. The plaque has a poem by former Bound Brook school teacher Martha Sparrow Baker. Though few remain who once met here, and scattered are afar and near, with love they hold in memory still the island schoolhouse on the hill, and gladly do they mark the spot that it may never be forgot.
The vegetation of Bound Brook Island has changed many times since the glaciers melted 15,000 years ago. Over most of the past 6,000 years, the upland forest was dominated by pines and oaks. However, by the mid-19th century, European settlers had nearly clear-cut this forest, leaving the open grasslands and heaths described by Henry David Thoreau in the 1850s. Note the total lack of trees and shrubs as late as the 1920s at the site of the school memorial, where there's not a tree in sight in the 1920s. With human depopulation of the Outer Cape in the late 1800s, caused by depletion of natural resources like forests, finfish, and shellfish, fields were abandoned, and today, 150 years later, the native New England forest is back. Studies of tree pollen and kettle pollen sediments show that today's regrown oak pine forest resembles that encountered by the Pilgrims in the 1600s. Next, the trail leads north through the forest and out into open heathlands on the north slope of the island. These are heathland plants along the trail on the north slope of Bound Brook Island at the Wellfleet Trail line. Open, grassy, and shrubby heath is what Henry David Thoreau described for nearly the whole Outer Cape in the 1850s. This relic heath probably survives because of exposure to severe winter northwest winds or perhaps an intense fire history. Nevertheless, with fire suppression over the past several decades, pitch pines and oaks are invading to shade out and eventually replace the open heath with forest. Looking northwest at the Bound Brook Island overlook, you can see heathland in the foreground, cattail marsh occupying the original saline Herring River floodplain, and Cape Cod Bay in the distance. The thin ribbon of open water in the marsh is all that's left of the original tidal creek that connected this wetland with Cape Cod Bay. It's thought that this inlet closed sometime in the 1700s due to natural coastal processes. Vegetation of Bound Brook Marsh, presently dominated by cattail and wildgrass, will again include areas of salt marsh plants when tides are restored to Herring River. The original tidal inlet into Bound Brook probably passed through those barrier dunes in the distance, which currently separate the freshened marsh from Cape Cod Bay. Before natural coastal processes filled the coastal marshes at Bound Brook and Duck Harbor with sediment, the Herring River actually had 4 inlets at Ryder Beach, Duck Harbor, Chickasset Neck, and Powers Landing. Old maps show salt works along the beach at Cape Cod Bay as you look to the left. Salt making declined due to the scarcity of lumber, the end of an embargo on Portuguese salt, and the invention of refrigeration.
We will now backtrack along the path and then turn uphill to the Lombard Cemetery. On the top of the hill, you can just make out the fence surrounding the cemetery. This is the Lombard Cemetery. In 1859, Mary Lombard, who lived with her family off Ryder Beach Road in Truro, died of smallpox. A law had been passed that no one who died of smallpox could be buried in the town cemetery. There was a fear that the dead bodies gave off a miasma that could affect the living. So Mary was buried here in this isolated spot on land belonging to the Lombard family. If you recall the houses we saw in Truro from the overlook looking north, one of them belonged to the Lombard family. At the time, the area was deforested, so her husband and other family members could see her grave from their kitchen window. This is the headstone of Mary Lombard. This is the engraving which shows that she died aged 44 years and 8 months. This is the headstone of Thomas and James Lombard. Neither her son James nor her husband Thomas died of smallpox, but they chose to be buried here. James died in 1870 at age 24. And even though he had remarried, when her husband Thomas died in 1873 at age 60, he chose to be buried with Mary. The next section of our walk goes through the woods to the modernist Hatch House. On the way, we have some nice views of Cape Cod Bay and Provincetown. We leave the cemetery and walk west. Along the way, we will enjoy some spectacular scenery. After a bit of a strenuous walk, we arrive at the Hatch House. The Hatch House was designed by Jack Hall in 1960 as a summer home for Robert Hatch, editor of The Nation magazine, and his wife Ruth, an artist. Jack Hall was born in 1913 and graduated from Princeton in 1935. He first came to Wellfleet in the late 30s and immediately took to the landscape and bought 180 acres on Bound Brook Island from Katie Dos Passos, wife of writer John Dos Passos, for $3,500. Hall was a self-taught architect who created a welcoming atmosphere for the European modernists who arrived in the United States in the mid-1940s, many of whom built summer homes in the woods of Wellfleet. Hall had an old Rolls-Royce, which he drove along the roads of the island and was often referred to as the Squire of Bound Brook Island. He died in the winter of 2003 in Wellfleet. The house is arranged as cubes. The living room and kitchen, the bedrooms, and the bath are all in separate components. Here is one of the modernist cubes. The house has 800 feet of living space with an additional 750 feet of deck and sits on almost 3 acres above Cape Cod Bay. A year after the death of Ruth Hatch in 2007, the house became the property of the Cape Cod National Seashore. The house has a wooden shutter system which hoists up to expose glass and screen panels that give both a breeze and a view of Cape Cod Bay. The modernist movement included features such as simplicity, severe geometric forms, and careful placement of the building in the environment. It is said that if the Hatch House were lifted and carried away, there would be no sign it had ever existed. The Cape Cod National Seashore has partnered with the Cape Cod Modernist Trust, which is restoring some of the modernist homes that belong to the seashore. They are to be used as educational and cultural resources and can be rented some of the time by the general public, the revenues being used to restore other modernist houses. If you rent this house, this is the kitchen, one of the bedrooms, and the living room. For the Hatches, this was a place where they casually entertained their artistic and intellectual friends, such as Serge Chermayeff, Noam Chomsky, the Jenkses, Edmund Wilson, and Marcel Breuer among them. The house is now on the Massachusetts Historic Commission's list of historic places. We will now leave the Hatch House and walk west down to Cape Cod Bay.
Wellfleet was, and still is, a hotspot for mass strandings of marine mammals. Shown are blackfish, also known as pilot whales. The oil from the whales was extracted in large vats called try-works, which were situated along the shore. Pilot whales were called drift whales when they stranded on their own. Before electricity, whale oil was used to light lamps. Later, it was used as a lubricant for watches and fine machinery. Profits from the sale of oil benefited all Wellfleet residents. Mention of mass strandings can be found in Thoreau's writings. He was on the Cape in 1855 when there was a mass stranding that stretched from Eastham to Truro, and he commented that walking on the beach was out of the question on account of the stench. Whale oil became so important to the town that spotters were hired to look for whales offshore. The whalers could be mobilized to drive the whales to the beach, as can be seen in the next 2 slides. Here, E.P. Cook stands behind a pilot whale whose head was removed to get at the oil sack. And here we see pilot whales that were herded to shore by Wellfleet whalemen. In winter, as the water temperature of Cape Cod Bay dips below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, sea turtles often wash up on the beaches. Some of these turtles are coal-stunned, but still alive. They are unable to swim south to warmer waters. There are now organized efforts to rescue these turtles and send them to the New England Aquarium for treatment, rehabilitation, and eventual release. And this last slide shows a close-up of a rescued sea turtle.
The walk now takes us from the beach at Bound Brook Island Landing over the dunes to Bound Brook Island Road and the Baker Biddle property. We have now arrived at the driveway to the Baker Biddle property. This property consists of the main house, 2 cottage-style buildings, and a studio which sits on 10 acres of land. In many ways, the history of this property mirrors that of the Atwood-Higgins property. A Cape-style house, in this case with many renovations, built in the 1700s, abandoned with the decline of Wellfleet's fishing economy in the 1800s, and revived as a summer residence in the early 1900s. The property is named for 2 families who lived here and had historical significance. The first is the Baker family. The house was built in 1790s by David Baker Jr., and it was the birthplace in 1840 of Lorenzo Dow Baker. Several generations of Bakers lived here until the collapse of the fishing industry. By the 1870s, the house was more or less abandoned. Katie Dos Passos, wife of the author John Dos Passos, bought the property in 1930 from the Baker family, but sold it shortly afterwards to Jack Hall, the architect of the Hatch House. As you can see here, Jack Hall is reassembling a barn he moved to the property. Jack Hall, like George Higgins, wanted to create a little settlement. This is the barn today, which was remodeled into a cottage by the Biddles. Jack Hall also built the studio from parts of an older building he moved here. This was again remodeled by the Biddles. The oldest building on the property is the Delight Cottage. It dates from the 1690s. It too was not original to the property, but moved from possibly Great Island, where it had been used as a try-works. It was called Delight Cottage from a sign taken from a brothel in Provincetown. The property was bought in 1949 by Francis and Catherine Biddle. The Biddles were a prominent Philadelphia family. Francis Biddle was a great supporter of the New Deal and a defender of labor rights. He served as Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General during World War II and was the chief American judge at the Nuremberg trials after the war. Catherine Garrison Chapin Biddle was a poet. She was a staunch supporter of civil rights and counted among her friends African-American poets such as Langston Hughes. Her poem, "And They Lynched Him on a Tree," was performed by the New York Philharmonic. Like the Hatches, they entertained extensively. Here is an excerpt from In Brief Authority by Francis Biddle. There are, I suppose, as many cocktail parties on the Cape as in Washington. At our end of the Cape, one rubs elbows with musicians and painters and writers. Xavier Gonzalez, Gardner Jenks, Edward Dickinson, Ed O'Connor, Edmund Wilson, Waldo Frank, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And a long-haired pretty beatnik now and then with overalls and dirty feet, whose mission is to remind us older birds not to be too goddamn fussy. Francis Biddle died in Wellfleet in 1968. His ashes and those of his wife and son are buried on the property. This is the memorial markers for Francis and Catherine, and this is the one for Edmund. In 2011, the Trust for Public Land bought the property from the Biddle family for $2.5 million and then conveyed it to the National Park. There are various agreements between the park and owners of land within the park as to sale of land and land usage. This piece, which consists of 10 acres, could have been sold as lots and the number of homes built. We will now finish by walking Bound Brook Island Road back to the Atwood Higgins house. The early settlers of the island came here in large part because of the Herring River. It provided an outlet to Cape Cod Bay as well as lucrative fishing. But by the time the Hatches, John and Katie Dos Passos, Jack Hall, and the Biddles lived here, the river was just a trickle, almost a memory. However, today, Friends of Herring River, the town of Wellfleet, Cape Cod National Seashore, and many other state and federal agencies and nonprofits are actively engaged in efforts to reconnect the Herring River with the marine environment. In this way, we hope to restore the very same natural resources that first attracted Native Americans and much later European settlement to this remote Outer Cape Peninsula. As we finish our walk, we will be passing the home of Sharon Dunn, a poet, who has written this poem for us. Herring River Restoration by Sharon Dunn. Its mouth will widen over years, water will flow and overflow in places it has not been in over a century. Will herring again run in millions? Will we fish once more at Bound Brook Island, below the Atwood Higgins house near the shimmering birches? We want to thank you for joining us on this walk of Bound Brook Island and hope you found it interesting and informative. We also want to acknowledge and thank the following: Cape Cod National Seashore, Wellfleet Historical Society and Museum, Library of Congress Prints and Photographs, Cape Cod Modernist House Trust, Bill Iquessa, Vice President, Wellfleet Conservation Trust, David Shapiro, teacher naturalist, Wellfleet Bay Wildlife Sanctuary, and Bill Burke, historian, Cape Cod National Seashore.